Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are facilitating an off-campus small group through Dayspring's ministry. If you're going to be leading a small group the week of November the 2nd, this video is designed to help you get ready to prepare for that small group time. So grab your Going Deeper guide for this week. I'm going to read it with you and talk through it and maybe give you some ideas that might help you as you get ready to lead your small group. So let's look at it together. You'll notice it's dated November 2 through 8 of 2014. Now, this handout goes with the new sermon series that we're starting on relationships and what relationships ought to look like and how we can have the kind of relationships really where God is found. So this small group discussion is going to accompany the introductory sermon of that lesson. So let's look at it together. The very first discussion point is what's going to lead you back to the introductory sermon. It says, discuss this statement from Sunday's sermon, that the gospel itself is our most complete relationship advice. Now, if you're watching this before the Sunday sermon, you may have some questions about that statement, but once the sermon comes and goes, that statement should make complete sense to you. So, you and your group will discuss that statement briefly, just to kind of get your, your mind rolling with what you heard Sunday, and I encourage you to take some good notes Sunday and to utilize that at this part of your small group discussion, and encourage other folks to get their notes out as well, and then that way you can kind of talk about what you heard and learned, and that will propel you into the next discussion point. So let's look at that. It says, read 1 John chapter 2, verse 6 together, and you'll notice that's your memory verse, so it's right there on your handout. It says, whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus did. Now, that's actually a memory verse we've had a couple of times over the past year, and this is a thing of repetition. And if you're not a believer in repetition, then I would say, how many in your group is going to have that verse memorized? If not, it just shows the need for repetition. So you're going to read that verse and look at it again. Whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus did. Now, look at the statement on discussion point number 2. It says, in light of this verse, it stands to reason that we should emulate how Jesus interacted with people, because that's the sermon series that we're starting. How do we deal with people? How do we relate to people? Well, if the Bible says that we need to walk as Jesus walked, then it only stands to reason that we need to relate with people and deal with people the same way that he did. So that's where this discussion guide is going to go. And by the way, it's where all the upcoming discussion guides are going to go. We're just going to be looking at the life of Jesus, seeing how he dealt with people, and learning what that would look like if we dealt with them the same way. So, it says, it stands to reason we should emulate the life of Jesus in terms of how he interacted with people. Now look at the next statement on discussion point number 2. It says, what do you know about the encounter that Jesus had with the Samaritan woman at the well? Now at this point, you're shown in discussion point number 2 where that's found in the Bible, in John chapter 4, and you can read that account. But what I encourage you to do at this point is not to read it together. Just at this point, allow people to say, well, here's what I remember about it. So talk through it. What do you remember about that encounter? Because this discussion guide is going to focus on what happened after the encounter, not so much what happened during. It's the after conversation where we're going to learn our lesson. So all you're doing right here is you're saying, hey, who remembers Jesus and his experience with the woman at the well? And at that point, let your group kind of talk through it. Now, if no one in the group really is all that familiar with it, or no one's really chiming in, then you're given the passage that you can read. So you may read it as part of the recollection of all of this. Now, here's what you need to do as a group facilitator. You need to be really familiar with the passage before group time, okay? And here's why I say that. If all of a sudden you say, hey, who remembers the experience with the woman at the well? And then all of a sudden people start recounting it, but they start getting their lines crossed with maybe another encounter Jesus had. You need to be the one who's able to recognize that and say, actually, I think that was another one. And then you can kind of get things back on track, okay? So what you need to do before group time, read the passage through in John chapter 4. Just read the whole thing. Get familiar with it so that, things stay on track as you recount it. Now, this particular encounter with Jesus, when you say, who remembers what happened, one of the things that should surface as people remember the account is that this is an encounter that Jesus had with a woman who really, her life was a mess, is really what it is. And this is where this discussion guide is going to focus, because what we're going to be doing in this series is learning how do we relate to people. Well, there are all kinds of different people that we have to relate with and relate to. This particular person was a messy person. She had a messy life, messy circumstances. So really what you're going to learn, how did Jesus deal with messy people? That's what you're going to learn. So here's some homework that you can do. 2 things I encourage you to do before group time as a facilitator. Number 1, thoroughly, read through John chapter 4. Thoroughly familiarize yourself with what actually happened here. Here's the second thing. You may do a little homework on the contentious relationship between the Jewish people and the Samaritans, because that was part of the dilemma here, and that's part of what really made her life so messy as far as the disciples were concerned. So let me point you to a resource that you can read, and it's not long. I mean, it's 1 page online, but it's very good. Go to www.bible.org, bible.org. And when you go there, there's a little search section where you can search for specific topics or articles. Just type in the word Samaritans. All right, Samaritans, Samaritans, Samaritans. When you do, it's going to bring up a list of articles. It'll probably be the very top article that's listed. It's called Hatred Between Jews and Samaritans. All right, so look at that article, Hatred Between the Jews and Samaritans. Read the article, and that's going to give you some background as to why people would have viewed this woman the way they did, in addition to all of her moral issues, but just her ethnic makeup. There would have been some things that the disciples would have said, this is a messy gal. So do your homework so that when your group comes to this point and you ask the question, who remembers Jesus' encounter about the woman at the well? When people are recounting all of this, you're going to be able to really keep it on the track in case it gets off the track, but you also may be able to add into the discussion that's going to really help people realize this was, this encounter Jesus had was it was a messy, messy relationship that he was walking into. All right, so that's discussion point number 2. This brings us to discussion point number 3. Check it out. It says, when it comes to how we are to relate to quote-unquote messed up people, which this woman was, the conversation that happens after this encounter teaches us as much as the encounter itself. So this is where you get into your Bible portion. You're going to read John chapter 4, verses 27 through 35. This is the after conversation between Jesus and his disciples, and it's in that conversation that we're going to learn our lesson about how we relate to messed up people. All right, so you're going to read that together, and let me read it with you right now. Look at this. John chapter 4, 27 through 35. Listen to this. It says, just then, Jesus' disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked, what do you want, or why are you talking to her? They were smarter than that, right? Then, leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ or the Messiah? They came out of the town and made their way toward him. Meanwhile, his disciples urged him, Rabbi, eat something. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you know nothing about. Then his disciples said to each other, could someone have brought him food? They just don't get it sometimes, do they? Verse 34, my food, Jesus said, is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Do you not say 4 months until and then the harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest. And so that's what you're going to read. Now, that's the conversation that Jesus has with the disciples after the conversation that he's had with the woman at the well. And there's much to learn from this for our purposes as it relates to how we interact with people, especially messy people, okay? So what Jesus says to the disciples is our lesson. So look at discussion point number 4. This is something that you're just going to read, and then it follows up with a question. So let's look at it together. It says, the disciples probably walked right past this woman as they left the well. Now that's just conjecture on our part, but that's probably what happened, because they go off she shows up. So they probably just walked right past her. They don't notice her, or they don't really pay her any attention. Now it says they probably walked right past her as they left the well. Now when they return, it's obvious that Jesus wasn't unconcerned for her. Well, why is that obvious? Because they walk up and he's talking to her. So they walk right past her, but when they come back, they should notice this is somebody that Jesus, he cares about her. There's an interest there. Now, it says, it's obvious that Jesus isn't unconcerned for her, yet their response is to minister to him. That's what we see in verse 31. Jesus, let us feed you. But his response is that there's a better quote-unquote food than what they offer, the food of doing God's will. Then he points them to where that food is found, in a city full of spiritually starving Samaritans. And this may be the part where you can add to the discussion with your group about why the Samaritans, why this was so significant. Because of the dislike and the discord between these two groups of people. Here's the thing. We know the verse where Jesus says, look to the fields, they're white unto harvest. What we probably have never paid attention to is the context in which he said it. He is actually pointing to a field full of Samaritans. And that is significant. Because here's the thing, Jesus just told them, what satisfies me is not so much bread that you're going to give me. What satisfies me is completing the work that the Father has given me. And the disciples are kind of looking around going, what is that? And he points to where the Samaritans are. And he says, right there. That's where I'm satisfied when I see you doing the work for them. Now, so back to our discussion. It says Jesus points them to where that food is found, a city full of spiritually starving Samaritans. Now here's where the rubber hits the road for us. You have to wonder if we do the same. Surrounded by messy people with messy needs, we want to quote unquote minister to Jesus by doing something like a Bible study at the church or attending yet another worship service. And these aren't bad, by the way. Those aren't bad things. But if we do those things so much that we're actually avoiding the harvest fields where the messy people are, because look, let's be really honest. It's a lot easier, it's a lot more fun to come to the church and hang out with other Christians, to study the Bible, to hold hands and pray and sing Kumbaya. That is so much easier than having to deal with messy people who don't know their right hand from their left hand. And here's the whole point in this. The disciples come back. They cross the paths with this woman again. They've yet to speak to her. Jesus points out that, there's a work to do. And their response is, well, Jesus, let us take care of you. Here's some food. And he points to where all of these Samaritans are and says, that's the food I'm interested in. So here's the question at the bottom of discussion point number 4. What are the implications here as it relates to our time in our relationship with other people? So think about it. Because here's what we're trying to learn here. How do we walk like Jesus walked? How do we enter into relationships the way that he entered into them? How do we have the same kind of relationships that he had? Well, here's an example of where there was a messed up person. So what did he do? Well, here's what he didn't do. He didn't ignore her like the disciples were doing. He didn't walk around her like the disciples were doing. He initiated contact with her. He paid attention to her. So think of all the things that Jesus did. Here's what we learn about our relationship with messed up people. Number 1, if we're going to be like Jesus, we have to invest time. We have to intentionally associate with and talk to and be around uncomfortable people. Because believe you me, this was an uncomfortable woman to be around because of the ethnic makeup, because of the social differences, because of the religious differences, because of the gender difference. In this context, everything about this encounter was uncomfortable. We learn from Jesus, we don't avoid those. We also learn that that we do the things that we probably wouldn't prefer to do. Because the disciples would just rather just sit there and eat food with Jesus. Jesus said, there's something better to be done. So these are all the things that we learn, that we have to invest time, that we have to intentionally associate with messed up people. We have to do some things that we'd rather not do. If you were to sum up all of those things, you know what that sounds like? It sounds like dying to ourselves, doesn't it? It sounds like putting ourselves aside and living for the benefit of other people. And you know what that sounds like? That sounds like the gospel itself. Because after all, the gospel itself is our model for relationships. So discussion point number 4, that's the whole teaching segment of this handout. What did Jesus say to the disciples after his encounter with the Samaritan woman? What does that teach us about how we need to walk if we're going to be walking like him? That's the whole discussion. Now, discussion point number 5 is kind of a follow-up, and it's kind of a poignant one. It kind of stings a little bit. It says, if, unbeknownst to you, someone followed you around for a week, who might they say has really captured your attention? In other words, who do you really pay attention to? And by the way, when people start answering this question, don't just think of people who we actually come into contact with, or people who actually see us. Could it be that our answer to this question has to do with people who are on the TV, people who we actually don't even interact with, but we pay them attention? So if somebody followed me around for a week, who would they say, Brett really is paying attention to so-and-so? And then there's a follow-up question. Look at this. Who might they say, you don't even seem to notice? Ouch. Who would people say, I don't even think Brett has noticed that person, despite the fact that he passed that person when he was leaving the well, despite the fact that he passed that person on his way back to the well, despite the fact that he passed that person on his way to the church to minister to Jesus. Who does Brett not even notice? And by the way, if you want a little good cross-reference on this from the Bible, check out Acts chapter 3. There's an account of these very same disciples passing a guy that they would normally pass up. But they don't pass him up. It seems as if maybe they're learning to walk like Jesus walked. All right? So that's your whole lesson. It's really designed to help us ask the question, who am I not paying attention to? Who are the quote-unquote Samaritan women in my life? What wells am I walking back and forth from every day? And if I'm going to walk like Jesus, how might I do that differently from this point on? Because after all, I want to have relationships that look like the gospel. All right, so that's your whole discussion. Obviously, discussion point number 6 is just a wrap-up statement that you can read when you feel like it's time to wrap it all up. All right, I hope this has been helpful to you. Don't forget to do your homework, reading John chapter 4 and checking out that passage on Bible.org. And you have a great time with your small group, all right? We'll see you Sunday.